We have some really interesting thermal testing for our GTX 1080 Ti review today. That's this thing right here, torn to pieces, as it so happens. We'll be going through those metrics, thermals versus frequency mostly, alongside the usual gaming benchmarks, and then we have some synthetics linked in the description below in the article, where there's a bit more depth on everything about this card. Before getting to the review, this coverage is brought to you by Thermaltake and their Tower 900 display case. This case has glass panels all around and is an excellent option for full custom water loops, which if you're buying a card that's $700, you might be in the market for. Link in the description below for more information. Going over price first. Again, the 1080 Ti is a $700 MSRP. Partners can ship above that, but the Founders Edition, still called that, the reference card basically, is still going to be $700, so they've removed the special Founders Edition price that caused so much confusion with a 1080 launch. So that's a good thing. This is $700 dead for the FE version and MSRP. With that announcement came the announcement of reduced MSRP for the GTX 1080s. There are already today on Newegg, Amazon, wherever, $500 GTX 1080s, including $530-ish EVGA SC models if you're looking a little bit overclocked, or gigabyte models for $500 flat. So the 1080s are already dropped. 1080 Ti is on the way, and AIB partner models of this card we're reviewing today should be available within a few weeks, pretty shortly actually, because this has been kind of in the wings for a while now. In the meantime, we're looking at the reference version. All of these cards ultimately are built on the new GP102 die. If you wanted the full identifier, it's GP102-350-K1. And that's for the die underneath the cooler, of course, and we've already taken the card apart for a few projects, which you'll see over the next few days. This block diagram of the GTX 1080 Ti shows its layout broken into 6 GPCs, or graphics processing clusters, in a similar fashion in some ways to how the GP100 is broken up, though with some pretty important differences in SM layout. The focus is removed from anything but FP32 with the GTX 1080 Ti, and we have 128 FP32 CUDA cores per SM, just like all the other Pascal cards in the gaming line. When counting a total of 28 SMs times 128, we're at 3584 CUDA cores in total. The GTX 1080 GP104 chip hosts 20 SMs, which totaled 2560 cores, so we're about 1,000 cores over the GTX 1080. This seems to align with NVIDIA's marketing claims that the 1080 Ti increases performance by 35% over the 1080 that launched in May of last year, that we'll be validating those claims throughout this video. The rest of the block diagram is familiar. We're faced with 224 TMUs and a base clock of 1480 MHz, or boost 1582, and that results in a texture filter rate of 354.4 gigatexels per second at the boost clock. We have a video on the channel already if you're not sure what that means. A total of 88 ROPs are present on the card compared to 64 on the GTX 1080, a bit of an upgrade there. And if you start totaling these things up, GP102 in some ways looks familiar to the GP100. It's got the same TMU count, the same GPC count, but they're still, again, significantly different in their targets. GP100, of course, is built for acceleration, not for consumer graphics, certainly not for gaming in any way. And this means that precision on GP100 splits itself between 32, 16, 64 capabilities, whereas 102 focuses on FP32 applications. GP102 is also a bigger die than the GP104, which was 314 millimeters squared, that's the 1080, and GP102 measures in at 471 millimeters squared, which helps accommodate the additional SMs. 8 additional SMs, so a bigger die area. Since we're getting on a plane in about 6 hours from filming this, we're gonna jump straight to the benchmarks. For the benchmarks today, we're using a fully rebuilt GPU test bench for 2017. I believe this is the first, I know this is the first GPU review other than the ICX card of 2017. That gives us an opportunity to move to the i7-7700K, which has a higher top end, more headroom and frame rate than the 5930K we were using previously. And it also means that we can refresh our suite of games and other applications being tested, including some new automation done by Patrick Lathan in-house. So that's really exciting. Now, this also means, for all of the excitement with a new test bed, we lose some data, and that's unfortunate. So everything on the previous tests can't really compare it anymore. It's a different platform, different memory, different drives, different testing methodology for the games. In Doom, we've changed how we tested a bit, and we've added new games. So that means that we lose things like the Titan XP comparison, since that was on loan to us. So we don't have that for you today, unfortunately, but we do have new numbers for the 1080, 1070, 980 Ti reference cards, the 1080 Ti reference card, and then one RX 480 just to throw it in there as a representative of the $250 market. So in the article below, we'll have the testing methodology as always. We'll also have numbers for future mark testing like 3D Mark, Firestrike, and Time Spy. Moving forward, we're refreshing our GPU bench with the relevant high-end contenders first, as listed, with a splash from the $250 market represented again by the 480. Note also that the 480 competes in a completely different price bracket, so we're not really going to pay too much attention to it. It's just there in case you want an idea of where things fall. We'll add Vega, of course, once it's ready, and we'll slowly add more GPUs to this bench with each content piece, including AIB models, if you're curious about those. And one final note here, because of the limited time between PAX, Ryzen, and other events, we are going to be visiting overclocking and noise testing separately. So those won't make it into this piece, unfortunately, but they will be in a piece post-PAX. Our thermal tests are up first. For these benchmarks, we're measuring MOSFET temperature in the middle of the board and at the bottom of the board, so that'll be FETs number 2 and 7 on the 1080 Ti, on the ICX GTX 1080, or FETs number 1 and 5 on the GTX 1080 FE card, counting bottom up. And those are measured with our thermocouples. They are K-types. They're calibrated in boiling and ice water as normally. And we have some more information on exactly what those things are in the article. Let's start with just the 1080 Ti, then add other cards. For now, we can see GPU temperatures in the 84 to 85 C range with MOSFETs numbers 7 and 2 closely packed around 65 to 68 C. This is actually heavily competitive to AIB partner FET temperatures, but the card is also only stock clock loads. And the GPU temperature, of course, looks dismal when compared to AIB partners. The card requires a significantly higher fan speed in order to sustain a comparable GPU temperature to what will be possible on AIB partners, and we can say that confidently because of previous experience with the 1080. And of course, you sacrifice noise output on the 1080 Ti FE version if you want to achieve those temperatures. To this end, despite using high-quality materials externally and internally, the cooler is actually not all that great for our audience. It's a better fit for system integrators, iWiPower, CyberPower et al. And if you have specific needs, maybe SFF, it could fit there as well. We're still recommending axial or liquid coolers for the most part though, because you're choking on the clock in a way which is unnecessary with the FE cooler. That's where AIB vendors come in, of course, to fix things. Here's a comparison to the GTX 1080 FE for frame of reference to the last gen of coolers from the Pascal lineup. We're seeing the GPU temperatures on each device locked to their max permissible limit when under stock settings, with the FET temperatures all within the same range. So that's actually a good thing. The GTX 1080 FE's middle MOSFET does run about a Celsius warmer, 1 degree Celsius or so, than the GTX 1080 Ti's middle MOSFET, but the card cools effectively identically when under a high stress workload, and of course these aren't the same FETs, they're not in the same place, so that does impact things as well. The measurement is not perfect. What matters is the frequency throughput though, and that is a perfect measurement, since both cards are boosting to a point of hitting thermal limits. Looking at the clock rate versus temperature, we can reveal that the 1080 Ti is able to sustain a higher, more stable clock when forcing its fan to 80%. This enters into territory of unbearable noise and is not representative of a sustainable user scenario without a noise damping box of some kind, maybe shoved into a basement, but it does show how the silicon behaves when temperature is no longer a concern. The GPU frequency on the 1080 Ti with auto fan speeds, or around 50%, shows that we're bouncing rapidly between about 1341, pretty low, to about 1544 megahertz. By contrast, the 1080 Ti at manual 80% fan speed posts frequency almost at a constant 1480 megahertz with occasional spikes to around 1544. Note that this is with a VRM power virus scenario, so we're seeing higher thermals despite a lower clock overall. That is expected behavior, and this clock rate is not representative of what you would see in a video game. Just to stick one of our ancient charts back up here, though we've now changed methodology to accommodate FET temperatures, these temperatures show at a steady state. So we're looking at how the GPU performs in terms of thermals once it has been left alone under heavy load for a long period of time. The 1080 Ti reference ends up around 58 C delta T for its steady state temperature when under torture workloads and with an auto fan control. The FE version of the 1080, meanwhile, sits around 57.5 C. That's well within our measurement variance, and so we must say that the 1080 FE alongside the 980 Ti and 1080 Ti are effectively equal in thermal performance. NVidia claimed 5 Celsius improvements with the 1080 Ti layout, but we can't exactly validate that on the same PCB, which is important because 1, GPU binning, 2, different GPU, 3, different VRM. We can't validate it exactly because we don't have a means to fit both coolers on the same card, at least within a reasonable amount of time. The changes to FETs, VRMs, all of that means it's not exactly an apples-to-apples comparison, but we are not seeing a 5 Celsius reduction stock. You might see it if you match the clock rates or something like that. If you're curious how an AIB partner board compares, our previous EVGA ICX review gives a good look at those numbers. In general, for thermals, you should expect the same high-ish to high temperatures for these reference designs for the 1080 Ti as with previous reference designs from both NVIDIA and AMD. NVIDIA is not alone here, neither is AMD. They both make reference designs that are versatile. They're good for SIs, they're good for other sectors of the market, but for our audience, for most of you doing system builds, DIY style, you're going to be better off with an AIB partner model that cools quieter and better, or at least, in the very least, quieter for the same. And that's really not a bad trade-off. This cooler is not particularly impressive, but neither was the 1080 FE's cooler. Despite that, NVIDIA's marketing did show in its presentation when Jensen was on stage in San Francisco, they showed a 2038 maximum clock rate with temperatures below 85°C. That may be possible in their test environment. We were not able to replicate that in our testing without making the fan speeds so high that they make your ears bleed, which may be the case. Just like with the 1080 in Austin, it may be that the card was in a box somewhere in a back room at 100% fan speed, because then I could see those temperatures being possible. But otherwise, I don't know that the 50% more bearable fan speed will make that a reality. If you do need a reference board for liquid blocks, for example, consider waiting for board vendors to ship their stripped down versions with the same PCB with disposable plastic coolers, because those might be a bit cheaper or include rebates at least to drag costs down a bit. Moving on to FPS, we're starting with a brand new game to our bench, Ghost Recon, using the built-in benchmark and set to very high preset at 4K, 1440, and 1080p. We are looking at GPU performance first with 4K. At 4K, the 1080 Ti pushes an average frame rate of 55 FPS with 1% lows at 45 and 0.1% lows at 42. Comparatively, the 1080 FE card runs about 10 FPS lower in all values for a difference in average frame rate of approximately 29%. That's not exactly the 35% number that was thrown around everywhere, but it's pretty damn close. The GTX 1070 reference card lands around 35 FPS average for the same test, for a performance improvement of about 58% when moving from the 1070 to the 1080 Ti. As for the last gen comparison, the 980 Ti reference card posts performance around 34 FPS average at 4K, which is really dragging into territory of being stuttery in this title. You could get away with 4K at lower settings, of course, but not with this setup. Shifting to 1440p, we see the GTX 1080 Ti operating at 91 FPS average with lows tightly timed at 74 and 66 FPS. That looks good in terms of the frame time consistency. The GTX 1080 is just under 20 FPS lower than that at 74 FPS average, with lows also fairly close, at least to the Ti, at 61 and 54. The improvement here from the 1080 reference card is about 22.5%. As for the GTX 1070 FE, the performance improvement is about 47 FPS from the GTX 1070 to the GTX 1080 Ti FE cards, moving us between 62 and 91 average. With the 980 Ti at 1440p, we're seeing a performance improvement of around 60% generationally. That's at 57 FPS average. Certainly playable. The RX 480 is on here, but again, with these settings being at very high and 1440p, it's not really targeted to benchmark these mid-range cards. It's a bit unfair. If you're looking at 1440p for a mid-range card, you'd have to drop your settings and it would still be playable, just drop the settings. But Doom is where we really start seeing things get a bit interesting. Our Doom benchmarking has ditched OpenGL for comparison entirely, mostly to make time for other tests, and instead pushes to strictly rely on Vulkan for the test API of choice. We're also now using ultra settings for graphics with anti-aliasing disabled and async turned on, so you can get that extra boost. You can find more in the article below. At 4K, Doom positions the 1080 Ti at around 90 FPS average with lows close behind and in the 70s. The GTX 1080 FE card stands around 68 average, resulting in an improvement of about 33% to the Ti. The 1070 was never really a 4K gaming device, but it's holding on respectably well with Doom at these settings. We're just under 60 FPS average and could make tweaks to go over 60. The difference is about 60 to 64% improvement with the 1080 Ti, but of course, That price is also about a 2x increase. The GTX 980 Ti performs at 49 FPS average at these settings and is mostly playable with the help of Doom's engine optimizations. You can make a few tweaks though. Looking now at 1440p, the GTX 1080 Ti is bumping against the limitations of Doom's frame rate, and that is an engine limitation. Doom limits itself to 200 FPS due to a physics bug, and so frame rates that exceed 200 FPS aren't really seen. They're capped. This skews numbers in a way that makes the higher end cards capable of exceeding 200 look a little bit lower in the charts, and just like a bottleneck would do, the only difference here is that rather than a CPU or GPU bottleneck, we have one that's not too commonly discussed, an engine bottleneck. We see these in GTA 5 for quad thread testing at 187.5 FPS as well, for similar engine reasons. We're starting to really illustrate generational differences here with the 980 Ti nearly doubled in performance by the 1080 Ti. Just to really illustrate this frame cap in Doom, let's look at 1080p. With this, our average is a steady 200 FPS, with lows no worse than 175, 0.1%. The GTX 1080 isn't far from this at 190 and performing effectively equally since they're both bottlenecked by the game engine. The 1070 hits 200 less frequently and is measurably behind. Of course, you would really, for the most part, play at these types of settings unless you have a 200Hz display, but it does show generational scaling better to the 980 Ti since that was even more common when it shipped. Moving to For Honor, one of our new titles added, we're testing with extreme settings across all three main resolutions. At 4K and Extreme, the 1080 Ti is finally able to crack 60 FPS in the game, though just barely. We're at 66 average with 60 FPS 1% low and 57 0.1% lows. You could get a 1080 to similar heights given an aftermarket card and some tuning, but we're talking about a drop of maybe one tick in settings to get there. The GTX 980 Ti is entering unplayable territory with these settings right alongside the RX 480. You would need settings reductions or just really honestly drop the resolution. And doing that, dropping to 1440p, the story changes a bit. Now, something like an RX 480 would be an excellent choice at its price point, roughly $250 if you wanted 1440p gaming with near max settings. A slight reduction would help frame times, but we're looking at the 1080 Ti today anyway, and the GTX 980 Ti, for a generational look at that, still holds its ground well against the new Polaris and Pascal cards, but posts an improvement of about 54 FPS by moving to the 1080 Ti, or around 70%. The GTX 1080 is plenty playable here with nearly 100 FPS average and tight frame times. Using Ashes for another DX12 look, configured to high settings, GPU focused on 4K, we're seeing the 1080 Ti land at 99 FPS average with the 1080 reference at 79, or about a 25% improvement to the 1080 Ti. Really not hitting that magic 35% figure in this test, though the jump from the 1070 is naturally a lot higher, though so is the jump in price. Again, we're looking at an improvement of about 62% to the Ti. Our final benchmark game is Sniper Elite 4. This was recommended by AMD for the bench. We spoke to both NVIDIA and AMD and gave them both an option to recommend one game for the bench. NVIDIA liked Ghost Recon, AMD liked Sniper Elite, so we added each. Although we're not looking in depth at AMD cards today, that time will soon come. At 4K and with high settings with async enabled and DX12, the 1080 Ti operates a frame rate of about 76 FPS average, pretty damn high for 4K, but Sniper isn't the most graphically intensive game on the market. The 1080 reference card sits at a hard 60 FPS with lows dipping into the 40s. This is still just fine for gameplay, and we're not able to start seeing more visible stutters until jumping to the 1070. Considering 4K is more of a 1080 or Ti class config, the 1070 holds well on its own at 48. We'll have to see how AMD does on this bench shortly, as it should be favorable for the Polaris and Vega GPUs given an async and DX12 focus. Given that we're sandwiched between PAX East in a few hours and Ryzen coverage and the Ryzen event and the NVIDIA event and other events, this review still has some things I'd like to add to it, like noise. Noise is one of the things overall we're not recommending an FE reference design anyway. If you were to buy a 1080 Ti, it should probably be a partner model. So the noise tests would be nice to further back that up and show things objectively, but they'll have to be added after PAX. In addition to this, you may have noticed that overclocking wasn't a major focus. We have one overclocking number with Firestrike Extreme on the website, but I was having some stability issues during overclocking in the last few hours before getting on this next plane, so we scrapped it. It'll have to come in the next content post, probably right after PAX. So there are still a few things to look at. Overclocking was the same process as always. It just didn't happen to be stable when we were working with this card. And that's really a matter of some more fine tuning, so we need time for that. Stock performance overall though of the GTX 1080 is still more than enough if you own one of those. don't bother upgrading to a 1080 Ti unless you have a very specific need. It's more of a side grade, so unless you're able to split the difference and trade in with a manufacturer, NVIDIA sort of is competing with itself by dropping the GTX 1080s in price anyway to $500, since that card can also handle 4K with some settings tuning and handles 1440p without much trouble at all. The bigger argument you could make would be for high refresh gaming, as the 1080 Ti fills that niche where others have fallen short, though have gotten quite close. 1440p at 144 Hz is doable in some of these games, like For Honor, if you're okay with dropping to high or very high from extreme in that case, assuming no anti-aliasing. For owners of a GTX 980 Ti, this is a sizable upgrade, and in some cases it's a pretty damn big jump if you want those higher resolutions. If you're not on higher resolutions, maybe don't bother. There's still mileage left in the 980 Ti. It's the 780 Ti that's the most interesting to look at, but again, unfortunately because of time, that wasn't added yet. Still, based on just extrapolating performance, that's probably where an upgrade makes the most immediate sense. It just comes down to what resolution you're trying to use. So the main reason to buy a Founders Edition card, as always, is going to be the reference PCB. There will be other reference PCB cards, but this is the first one. If you want it, it'll be out there. EKWB already has plans for water blocks compatible with this PCB. The 1080 FE water blocks won't work. It's a different board, different VRM layout, but there are plans already for water blocks in the works. We've spoken with them about that. Otherwise, wait on partner models for cooling reasons and for potentially custom PCBs, potentially better overclocking. We've also got BuildZoid working on a VRM analysis of this board. This is quite a bit different from the 1080. So for this board, we're looking at a VRM that is doing some doubling action. So you've got 2 FETs per phase, which does spread out the heat a little bit. So that would help explain why the VRM temperatures on this board are actually really good. They're comparable to an ICX video card, the ones EVGA just launched, and that's a good thing. The place it falls behind is GPU cooling, as expected and as seen in the past, but the VRM design does spread out heat a bit and helps in that scenario. As for whether it's worth buying, this is sort of a weird market position right now where NVIDIA exists largely uncontested. AMD's last major cards in this type of market were the Fury X and Fury cards, and the RX 480 is the newest thing that they have, and it's an extremely strong competitor. At the 200, 250-ish price point, that's a pretty good winner. It holds that market very strongly while AMD is waiting on Vega. So they're in a good position for the mid-range. They just don't have anything at the high end yet, which makes this a weird thing to review because there's not a lot of competition. So what we can say is that the 1080 Ti, if you don't need an upgrade now, today, if you're not building a system this week or something like that, it's probably worth looking into if you're looking at a high budget card. That said, the 1080 does sort of compete with the 1080 Ti. If you don't need those 144, 120 Hz refresh hits, you can drop down to a 1080. It's still a damn good card, and you save a lot of money. You can put that money towards something better in the system, like better SSDs or something like that. If you do need to upgrade today, there's no shame, there should be no remorse in buying a 1080 Ti, 1080, something like that. Vega will come, we will review it. It's just a matter of when at this point. We know first half, and that's really all we know in terms of specifics. There's not out there. So Vega will be compared eventually. The RX 480 still looks good at the $250 price point. We would recommend that in that category. The 1060 is good, but look between the two and figure out what games you're playing because they have advantages. The 480 at its price is very competitive. 1070 is still good, 1080 is still good, 1080 Ti is great for its gains. It doesn't always have that 35% number, but overall it's a good card. It's just a matter of getting better cooling on the thing so it can perform to its full potential, which is something we're doing, if you can't tell by this setup. So, as always, go to patreon.com/GamersNexus to help us out directly, gamersnexus.net for the full review. Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. Quick shout out for anyone who wants 3440 by 1440p benchmarks, 1440, I guess. If you want those ultra-wide benchmarks, one of our friends of the site, techgauge.com, will have that stuff. He does it where I don't, so check him out if you want the ultra-wide stuff. I trust his numbers. We'll see you all next time.